This is Eon History. Tonight, a chapter from A Night in Ancient Pompeii, the slow hours before the ash. Settle in. The light is low. The hour is long. The evening came down over the Bay of Naples the way it always had, in a slow wash of copper and gray, and the town of Pompeii breathed out the last warmth of the day. On the southern slope of the mountain the Romans called simply Vesuvius, the vineyards held their heat into the dusk, and the air carried the faint mineral smell of the soil, rich, dark, volcanic, though no one living understood why the grapes grew so well there. A cart rolled somewhere along the basalt paving of the Via dell'Abbondanza, its iron-rimmed wheels finding the deep ruts worn by a century of traffic. Lamps were being lit behind shuttered windows. The mountain stood quiet against the fading sky, green to its summit, wearing its forests like a mantle, and it gave no sign at all. We do not know the exact night, and that uncertainty is itself part of the story. For centuries, the date was held to be the 24th of August in the year we number 79, fixed by a line in a letter that has come down to us through many copyists' hands. But the evidence now suggests otherwise. The charcoal inscription found scratched on a wall during recent excavations carries a date in mid-October, the 16th day before the calends of November, and it could only have been written in the weeks before the town died. Carbonized autumn fruit, braziers already in use, heavier clothing on the bodies. All of it points toward a cooler season. So let us imagine an evening in October, when the light goes early and the first chill settles after sunset. In a town of perhaps 11,000 souls, the evening had a shape to it, and that shape was old. The Forum had emptied of its midday crowds. The basilica, where men argued over contracts and debts beneath its high columns, had fallen silent, its marble floor cooling underfoot. Along the main streets, the great stepping stones still held the day's heat, and the person crossing them could feel it rise through the soles of their sandals, while the gutters below ran with the last of the afternoon's washing water. The bakers were already awake somewhere in their thoughts, for their work began in the dark, and in the houses the lamps came on one by one, small flames of olive oil burning in bronze and clay, throwing their amber light against painted walls. Consider one such house, of the kind the excavators have laid open to the sky in the long years since. You entered from the street through a narrow corridor, the fosses, and the noise of the town fell away behind you. Ahead lay the atrium, open to the air at its center, where a shallow basin called the impluvium caught the rainwater beneath a square of darkening sky. The floor was patterned in small stones and chips of colored marble. The walls carried frescoes, gardens that did not exist, birds that never flew, architecture painted to deceive the eye into seeing depth where there was only plaster. In the evening, these rooms held a particular stillness, the household drawing inward, the day's business done, the lamps gathering the family into their pools of light. We know these houses by the names the archaeologists gave them, not the names their owners used. The House of the Faun, vast and old with its bronze dancing figure in the rainwater pool. The House of the Veti, restored and reopened only in recent years after decades of careful work, its walls bright again with the reds and golds that two freedman brothers, grown wealthy in trade, had paid to have painted. The House of the Tragic Poet, with its famous mosaic at the threshold, a chained dog, teeth bared, and beneath it, two words in tesserae, cave canem, beware of the dog. A small joke and a small warning set into the floor where a visitor's eyes would fall. In such a household, the evening meal was the gathering point of the day. The Romans called it the cena, and for those with means it came in the late afternoon and stretched into the dark. The family reclined on couches in the triclinium, propped on the left elbow, eating with the right hand from low tables. The food of Pompeii has come down to us not through recipes alone, but through the things the ash preserved. And what it preserved is sometimes astonishing in its ordinariness. eggs, olives, bread, fish, lentils, figs, walnuts, the bones of small birds, the shells of sea urchins gathered from the bay that very day. There was a sauce the whole region lived on, and its smell would have hung about the kitchens and the harbor warehouses alike. The Romans called it garum, and it was made from fish, the guts and small whole fish layered with salt and left in the sun for weeks until they liquefied into a clear, sharp, savory liquid, pungent and pervasive, that they poured over nearly everything. Pompeii was famous for it. One merchant in particular, a man named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, built a fortune on it, and the small clay jars that carried his garum across the Mediterranean bear his name stamped into the handles. In his house, the floor mosaic itself depicts these jars, with proud little labels, "The finest sauce from the workshop of Scaurus." A man could be vain about fish sauce. The evening air near the harbor would have carried that smell, salt and ferment and the sea, mingling with wood smoke as the cooking fires were banked low. Bread, too, the ash kept for us. In the ovens of Pompeii's bakeries, archaeologists found loaves still in place, round, divided into segments like the spokes of a wheel so they could be torn apart by hand at the table. 81 of them were found in a single oven in one bakery, baked on the last morning and never sold. One loaf carried a stamp pressed into its crust before baking, naming its maker. Celer, the slave of Quintus Granius Verus. We have, in that small charred disk of bread, the name of a man who was someone's property, who rose before dawn, who shaped dough with his hands, and whose loaf outlasted the empire that owned him. The bread is black now, light as cinder, but its shape is perfect. You can see the cut marks. You can see where the knife went in. The work of the bakery tells us much about how the town actually lived, beneath the painted walls and the talk of fortunes. Behind the selling counter stood the millstones, great hourglasses of gray volcanic lava, the lower stone fixed, the upper one turned around it. They were turned by mules or by donkeys, or sometimes by men, walking in a slow circle hour after hour, blindfolded so they would not grow dizzy and balk. In one bakery in the part of town the excavators label Regio 9, recent digging uncovered a cramped back room with high, small windows barred against escape, the floor scored with grooves to guide the animals' endless circling. The people who worked there, the archaeologists believe, lived and slept and labored in the same dim space, never going out. It is a hard truth set against the soft light of the painted houses, and it belongs in the picture as much as the frescoes do. For Pompeii ran on the labor of the enslaved, as all Roman towns did, and most of that labor is invisible to us, because it left no inscriptions and commissioned no portraits. But the ash, indifferent and exact, recorded what the historians did not. It kept the back rooms and the service corridors and the narrow stairs the family never used. It kept a small room with a single window and a few simple objects, a chest, a lamp, a chamber pot, discovered in recent years in a villa just outside the town, which the excavators came to believe was the sleeping quarters of slaves. There was no decoration. There was no comfort beyond the bare necessities. And yet there were the marks of people, the wear on a wooden surface, the careful storage of small belongings, the human habit of making a place one's own even in the absence of freedom. As the light failed, the town turned to its smaller pleasures. On nearly every corner stood a thermopolium, a counter open to the street set with great earthenware jars sunk into the masonry, from which a passerby could buy hot food and wine. These were the eating houses of people who had no kitchens of their own, or no time, or simply wanted the company of the street. One such counter, excavated only in recent years in Regio 5, came out of the ground almost intact, its front painted with a rooster, with ducks hanging by their feet, with a dog on a leash and a line of mocking graffiti someone had scratched beside the painted animal. Inside the buried jars, the residue told what had been served: duck, pig, goat, fish, and snails, all together, perhaps in a single stew. There were crushed fava beans found in the bottom of one jar, added, it seems, to tint the taste of the wine. Wine was everywhere, and it was not the wine we know. The Romans cut it with water, often warmed it, sweetened it sometimes with honey or with a syrup of boiled grape must, and flavored it with spices and resin. To drink it neat was thought the mark of a barbarian or a drunk. In the evening, the wine counters filled with the sounds of the day's last commerce, the clink of bronze coins, the scrape of cups, low laughter, an argument starting and dying away. Above one such counter, a painted sign survives in which the figures speak in lines written beside their mouths, like the breath of a comic strip. A quarrel over a game of dice, two men insisting the throw was theirs, and the landlord telling them to take it outside. The walls of Pompeii talked. They are still talking. For the people of this town wrote on everything, and this is one of the rare gifts the disaster left us. More than 11,000 pieces of writing have been recovered from its walls. Election notices, advertisements, prices, insults, declarations of love, lines of poetry copied out, and the plain, unguarded scribbles of ordinary people who never expected to be read by anyone, let alone by us, across the gulf of 19 centuries. Someone wrote on a wall in the basilica that they wondered how the wall had not yet collapsed under the weight of so much tedious graffiti. Someone wrote that Phidias was here. Someone recorded with simple satisfaction that they had eaten well. Someone, on the wall of an inn, complained that the innkeeper watered the wine and that they hoped he might choke on his own cheating. These voices are not grand. They are not the voices of senators and generals that fill the histories. They are the voices of bakers and barmaids and schoolboys, of men in love and men in debt, and they reach us precisely because they were trivial enough to be written on a wall and forgotten. A child practiced the alphabet on a column. A man named Successus loved a slave girl, and a rival named Severus wrote beneath his declaration to mock him, and Successus wrote back, and the two of them carried on their quarrel in chalk on a public wall. And all of it survives. The love, the mockery, the reply, fixed forever at the moment the ash came down. We do not know how it ended for any of them. We know only that on some evening, much like this one, they cared. In the streets, the lamplighters' work was a private matter. There were no public lights to speak of, and once the sun was gone, the town belonged to the dark. A person abroad after nightfall carried a lantern of horn or bronze, its small flame guarded behind translucent panels of scraped animal horn, throwing a soft and shifting light a few paces ahead. The well-off were escorted by slaves with torches. The streets, unlit, grew quiet and a little dangerous, and most people stayed within doors. The stepping stones that let pedestrians cross the streets without stepping into the filth of the gutters became, in darkness, hazards to be remembered by feel. The town drew its shutters. The wooden bars went up across the shop fronts. The day's commerce sealed itself away behind oak and iron. Within the better houses, the evening softened into its private hours. A wealthy household might have a small library, not of bound books, for the Romans did not yet have them, but of scrolls, rolls of papyrus wound on wooden spindles and stored in round boxes or pigeonholes, each with a little tag hanging from its edge to name its contents. In a great villa at nearby Herculaneum, the sister town that died the same night, an entire library of such scrolls was buried and carbonized, more than 1,000 of them, blackened into what looked at first like lumps of charcoal. For 2 centuries they could not be read. Only now, with light that the Romans could not have dreamed of and machines that read the density of carbon ink against carbon page, are scholars beginning to unroll them without touching them, to coax words from the dark. A treatise on pleasure, on the nature of things, on how a person ought to live. The irony is gentle and complete. The words on how to live, preserved by the thing that ended living. But most of Pompeii owned no scrolls and read no philosophy. For most, the evening's entertainments were simpler and louder. There were the baths, and a Roman town without baths was hardly a town at all. The bathhouses stayed open into the evening, heated from below by furnaces that drove hot air through hollow spaces beneath the floors and inside the walls, so that the floors grew warm enough that bathers wore wooden sandals to keep from burning their feet. A person moved through the rooms in sequence: the cold room, the warm room, the hot room thick with steam. Sweating, scraping the oil and grime from their skin with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, then plunging into cold water and beginning again. The baths were where the town talked. Deals were struck there. Reputations were made and unmade. The voices echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and beneath it all ran the constant low roar of the furnaces and the drip and slap of water on stone. The smell of the baths would have followed a person home: wood smoke and scented oils, sweat and damp stone, the particular mineral tang of the heated water. In the changing rooms, niches in the walls held the bathers' folded clothes, and a slave watched over them, for theft was common and the graffiti complain of it. A man writes that his bronze pot was stolen from the baths and offers a reward, and curses the thief in elaborate terms. The small economy of trust and suspicion that runs through any crowded place ran through Pompeii too, written plainly on its walls. No different in its anxieties from any town that has ever existed. Outside the town walls, along the roads that led toward Naples and toward Nuceria, the dead kept the living company. The Romans buried their dead beside the roads, in tombs that ranged from grand marble monuments to simple markers, and these lined the approaches to every gate. A traveler arriving at evening passed first through this city of the dead before reaching the city of the living. The tombs of the proud, with their carved inscriptions reminding the passerby of the achievements of those within, and their requests, sometimes touchingly direct, that the reader stop a moment and remember. One epitaph asks the traveler simply to think kindly of the dead. Another records the offices a man held, the games he gave the town at his own expense, the esteem in which he was held. The tombs faced the road on purpose. They wanted to be read. To be remembered was, for a Roman, a kind of immortality, and the worst fate was to be forgotten entirely. The town these tombs guarded was itself old, far older than the Romans who now filled it. Pompeii had begun centuries before as a settlement of the Oscan-speaking peoples of the region, had passed under the influence of the Greeks who colonized this coast, then the Etruscans, then the Samnites, before falling at last under the power of Rome. Its oldest walls were built of gray volcanic stone, laid down long before any Roman set foot there. Latin had only gradually replaced the older Oscan tongue, and traces of that earlier language survive, in the names of streets, in inscriptions, in the way certain things were measured and certain gods were named. The town that died in 79 was a layered thing, a palimpsest of peoples, Roman on the surface and far older underneath. And it had been wounded already, though it did not understand the warning. 17 years before the end, in the year we number 62, a great earthquake had struck the region and shaken Pompeii badly. The philosopher Seneca, writing soon after, recorded that buildings collapsed, that a flock of hundreds of sheep died in the fields, killed, he supposed, by some corruption of the air, by exhalations from the ground that proved poisonous to the animals, and that people fled the towns in fear, some so shaken in their minds that they wandered the countryside, unable to be calmed. We understand now what Seneca could not, that the earthquake and the dying sheep and the corrupted air were all the same thing. The deep stirring of the mountain, the underground pressure of the magma seeking its way upward. To the Romans, these were separate omens. To us, they are a single sentence, and we know how it ends. In the 17 years that followed, Pompeii rebuilt. The work was still going on when the end came. The excavators find it everywhere. Walls half repaired, frescoes freshly painted over older damaged ones, marble cladding stripped from one building to mend another, scaffolding and stacked materials, and the ordinary mess of a town putting itself back together. The Forum was a construction site. The temples were under repair. Some of the wealthy had not yet come back, and their houses were occupied by builders and squatters and the works of restoration. The town wore its scars and was busy covering them, the way the living always are, attending to the surface and trusting the ground beneath their feet. There is something in that image that stays with us, a whole town patching its walls, never knowing that the wound was not in the walls at all. So the night we are imagining was an ordinary night in a town that thought itself recovering. The fires were banked. The shutters were closed. The lamps burned low on their last oil and were pinched out one by one, and the smell of their smoke lingered in the dark rooms. In the harbor, the ships rode at their moorings and the water lapped against the hulls, and the night fishermen prepared their nets by the light of small flames. In the countryside around the town, in the great villas where the wine and oil were made, the presses stood idle and the autumn stores were sealed in their jars. The mountain stood over all of it, dark against the stars, and in its depth, far below the vineyards, the pressure was rising. We have one account of what came next, and only one, written by a man who watched it from across the bay and who lost someone he loved in it. His name was Pliny. We call him Pliny the Younger to distinguish him from his uncle of the same family. He was a boy of 17, staying with his mother and his uncle at Misenum, across the wide curve of the bay, where his uncle commanded the Roman fleet. Years later, a historian named Tacitus wrote to ask him what he had seen, and Pliny answered in 2 letters that survive, calm and precise and full of grief held carefully in check. They are the only eyewitness words we have. Everything else we know, we have dug out of the ground. Pliny wrote that it was early in the afternoon when his mother pointed out to her brother a cloud of unusual size and appearance rising from across the bay. The elder Pliny, a scholar, a writer, a man of restless curiosity who had compiled a vast encyclopedia of the natural world, went out to look, and then called for his sandals and climbed to a place where he could see the strange thing better. The cloud, the younger Pliny wrote, rose like a tree, like one of the umbrella pines that grew all along that coast, a tall, straight trunk of smoke spreading at its top into branching limbs. It was white in places, and dirty and stained in others, depending, he thought, on whether it carried ash or earth. We have given that shape his name. We call such an eruption Plinian, after the boy who described it. But that was the afternoon, and our night comes before. Picture the hours just before that cloud, the last fully ordinary hours the town would ever have. The morning of that day broke like any other. The bakers had been at work since before dawn. The 81 loaves were already in the oven. The animals turned the millstones in their dim back rooms. The water ran in the public fountains, fed by the great aqueduct, splashing into stone basins worn smooth by generations of hands and lips and water jars. The fullers, who cleaned and dyed the cloth, trod their fabrics in vats of water and stale urine collected from the public latrines, and the sharp ammoniac smell of their trade drifted from their workshops. The school children gathered, perhaps, in the shade of a portico, reciting their letters. It was, by every sign the ground has given us, a completely unremarkable day. And then, sometime around midday or the early afternoon, the mountain opened. The first phase, the geologists tell us, was the great rising column that Pliny saw. Gas and pumice and ash blasted miles into the sky, so high that it spread out flat against the upper air and began to drift on the wind, southeast, directly over Pompeii. And then it began to fall. Not ash at first, but pumice, light, frothy stones of cooled volcanic foam, some no larger than a pea, raining down on the town in a steady, thickening hail. It was not, at first, deadly. It was strange and frightening, and it grew worse by the hour, but a person could still move through it, could still flee, could still climb a stair to the roof and look up at the impossible darkening sky. This is the part of the night that the casts remember. For the falling pumice piled in the streets and against the doors hour after hour through the afternoon and into the evening and the long night that followed, until it lay several feet deep, and roofs began to groan and buckle under its weight, and the choice each person faced grew narrower with every hour. To stay was to risk the roof. To flee was to go out into the dark, under a sky raining stone, breathing air thick with sulfur and dust, with the ground trembling and the sea behaving strangely, and the way ahead impossible to see. Many fled. The roads out of town, the excavators find, are not crowded with bodies. Most of the people of Pompeii got out in those first hours, into the dark, carrying lamps and keys and small bags of coins, hoping the sky would clear. Some stayed. And here the ground has given us its most intimate and its most disputed testimony. For when the pumice finally stopped, near dawn, there came something far worse. The great cloud, no longer able to hold itself up, collapsed and rushed down the mountain as a surge of superheated gas and ash, faster than a person could run, hot enough to kill in an instant. It came in waves, several of them through that final morning, and the last and greatest of them reached Pompeii and filled it and ended it. The people who had survived the night of falling stone did not survive the dawn. The surge sealed the town in fine, hot ash that hardened around everything it touched, and then, slowly, over the years, the bodies within decayed and left behind them hollow spaces in the hardened ash, perfect molds of the moment of death. It was an excavator of the 19th century, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who understood what those hollows were and devised a way to fill them with liquid plaster and let it set and then chip away the surrounding ash, and so to lift out a cast of a human being in the last posture of their life. The casts are the most famous things Pompeii has given the world, and they are almost unbearable to look at. The person with their hands raised, a person curled inward, a person lying as if asleep, the folds of cloth still visible, the shape of sandals, the set of a jaw. They have been read for 150 years as a frozen tableau of a family's last moments, of mothers shielding children, of love in extremity. And here recent science has spoken, quietly and carefully, into that long-told story. In the last few years, researchers have been able to extract ancient genetic material from the bones preserved inside some of the casts, and what they found does not always match what generations of visitors were told. A group long described as a mother with a child on her lap wearing a golden bracelet was found to include at least one adult male who was not related to the child. Two figures shown in what was read as a tender embrace, often described as two women or as sisters, included at least one man. The genetic evidence suggests that the people who died together in Pompeii were not always the families that later imagination made of them, that some who clung to one another in the dark were strangers, or friends, or bound by ties we cannot now recover. It is less often noted, in the popular telling, how much of what we feel when we look at the casts is what we have brought to them ourselves. This does not make the casts less moving. It may make them more so. For it means that in the final dark, people reached for whoever was near, that the impulse to hold and be held in the last moment did not wait on blood or name. The genetics give us the bare fact. This person and that person died together. The rest, whether they loved one another, whether they were known to each other an hour before, whether the gesture was protection or only the body's last seeking of warmth, the rest is silence. And we should be honest that it is silence, and not fill it too quickly with the stories we prefer. But all of that lay still ahead in the hours after the night we are dwelling in. Let us go back, before the column rose, to the evening before, the last evening, the slow hours, the town at its quiet business under the early dark of October. For the gift of Pompeii is not really the day it died. It is the 10,000 ordinary days it lived. All of them collapsed into the single instant the ash preserved. When we walk its streets now, what we are walking through is not a catastrophe. It is a Tuesday. It is the bread in the oven, and the wine in the jar, and the dog on the threshold, and the love note on the wall. The disaster is only the frame. The picture is the life. So consider the household once more, in the last lamplit hour before sleep. The cena was finished, the tables cleared by the slaves, the scraps thrown out or saved. In a house of any substance, the family might linger over the wine, and a guest might recite some verses, and the talk would turn over the small matters of the town, a marriage, a debt, the games coming to the amphitheater, the election notices freshly painted on the walls outside, in which one citizen after another was recommended to office by his neighbors, the Bakers' Guild backing one man, the muleteers another, even, in one surviving notice, the late drinkers of a certain tavern claiming, perhaps in jest, to support their candidate. Politics in Pompeii was a neighborhood affair, painted in red letters at eye level, and it filled the evening's conversation as it filled the walls. The children would have been put to bed in small rooms off the atrium, on simple beds with woven cord supports and woolen mattresses, under blankets of wool against the autumn chill. A lamp might be left burning low, or might not. The Romans rose early and slept early, their day shaped by the sun far more than ours, and the dark hours were long. In the deep of the night, the town belonged to the night watchmen, where there were any, and to the bakers beginning their work, and to the rats in the granaries, and to whatever moved in the unlit streets. The fountains ran on, never stopping, their water spilling and splashing in the empty squares. The lamps in the temples burned before the images of the gods, Venus, the town's own patroness, to whom a great temple was being built when the end came. Apollo, ancient on this coast. Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose worship had crossed the sea and found ardent devotees here, her temple small and richly painted and tended through the night. The Temple of Isis is one of the places where the human shape of that last night presses hardest against us. When the excavators reached it, they found the remains of a meal interrupted. The priests, it seemed, had been eating when the eruption began and had fled, and some had not got far. The cult of Isis promised its followers something the older Roman gods did not quite offer: a personal devotion, a hope of rebirth, a goddess who knew grief herself and could meet the griever in it. Her rites were performed at dawn and at dusk, with water carried from a sacred well, with music of the sistrum, a metal rattle that shivered and hissed in the incense-thick air. On an ordinary evening, the last rite would have been performed as the light failed, the doors closed, the lamps left burning, the goddess left to her night. Around the temples and the houses and the shops, the town wall held its old circuit, pierced by 7 gates, and beyond the gates the roads ran out into the dark countryside where the villas slept among their vines. The land here was crowded with farms, for the volcanic soil was generous beyond reason, and the wine of Pompeii traveled far. In the great wine-making villas, the autumn vintage had lately been pressed. The new wine lay fermenting in huge clay jars sunk to their necks in the floors of open yards, and the air around them was sweet and sharp with the smell of it. In one such villa, at a place we now call Bosco Reale, the excavators found a hoard of silver vessels, exquisite cups worked with scenes of skeletons and mottos urging the drinker to enjoy life while it lasts, for death comes to all. The Romans liked to keep that thought close at the table, to drink deliberately in the company of their own mortality. They did not imagine how literal the lesson would prove. The night deepened. We may suppose the soft sounds that fill any town after dark, a dog answering another dog across the rooftops, a baby's cry quieted, the creak of a shutter, a snatch of song from some tavern not yet closed, the endless water in the fountains, the wind moving over the tiled roofs and through the open atriums and down the narrow streets. The sea breathed against the harbor wall, the vineyards rustled on the mountain's flank, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars the Oscans had watched and the Greeks had named, and the mountain stood among them, dark and patient and full. It is hard, knowing what we know, to dwell in that peace without the shadow falling across it. But the people of that night did not have our knowledge, and to honor them is, in part, to grant them their ignorance, to let them have their ordinary evening without the weight of the ending we carry for them. They banked their fires not knowing they were the last fires. They closed their shutters against a chill that would soon mean nothing. They said whatever people say to one another at the end of a day, the small, unmemorable words, "Good night," and "Sleep well," and "We will see to it tomorrow." And they meant the ordinary tomorrow, the tomorrow of bread and water and work, and not the tomorrow that came. The castes found in the deepest layers, the ones who died at the very end, in the surge of the final morning, are often found in postures of rest or of waiting, or of a last seeking of shelter, under stairs, in cellars, beneath the eaves. Some had survived the whole night of falling stone, had endured the dark and the noise and the slow burial of their town, and had chosen, when the pumice stopped near dawn, to wait a little longer rather than flee into the unknown. We cannot blame them. The night had been a horror. The morning seemed perhaps to bring a lull. The pumice had ceased. The worst, it might have seemed, was over. And then the mountain drew its breath and exhaled the heat that ended everything. And the waiting was over too. There is a quietness to how Pompeii died that the loudness of the word eruption does not capture. For the people inside the town, the end, when it finally came fast. The surge was a matter of moments, and most who were caught in it likely felt little. The long agony was the night before, the hours of waiting and choosing, the slow accumulation of stone and dark. And then the town lay sealed for 16 centuries, its streets full, its tables set, its bread in its ovens, its love notes on its walls, while the world above forgot it had ever existed. Vines grew over the mound, farmers plowed the slope. The very name of the place faded until it survived only in a faint local memory, a word for a hill, La Civita, the city, with no one quite sure what city was meant. The rediscovery, when it came slowly too, over centuries of digging that ranged from careless plunder to the patient and exacting science of our own time. And with each layer the excavators lifted, the town gave back a little more of its last evening, a little more bread, a few more words, another room, another lamp still holding the dried oil it had burned that night. The work is not finished. Whole districts remain buried still, sleeping under their blanket of ash, and the archaeologists have learned to go slowly, to leave some of it for a future with better tools and gentler methods, knowing that every excavation is also a kind of destruction, and that what is uncovered begins, the moment it meets the air, to fade. What remains uncovered keeps its secrets in the dark, much as the town kept them through all those centuries, the colors brighter for never having seen the sun, the wood unburned, the small things in their places where the last hands left them. There is a tenderness in that thought, in the idea of a town held in waiting beneath the earth, neither alive nor wholly gone, its evening suspended, its lamps eternally just extinguished, the smoke of them still, somehow, hanging in the sealed and lightless air. We go down to it carefully, a little at a time, the way one moves through a sleeping house so as not to wake anyone. And so we leave Pompeii where it is most itself, not in the morning of its death, but in the slow evening before, the hour of banked fires and closing shutters and the last low talk of an ordinary family in an ordinary town on an ordinary night, with the wool drawn up against the chill and the lamp burning down and the great dark mountain keeping its silence above the sleeping vines. The bread is in the oven, the wine is in the jar, the dog lies on the threshold, and the words beneath it, "Beware," mean only what they have always meant, a small joke for visitors, and nothing more. The fountains run, the sea breathes, the stars turn, and the town settles into the long quiet of the night, not knowing it is the last, which is perhaps the only mercy the night had to give. That is where we leave it for tonight. The lanterns are dimming. Sleep well, and we will meet in the next age.